All right, welcome to the 5th workshop on the Freudian Unconscious. I'm Cadell Last, and we are going to be talking about two technical papers today from 1904 and 1905, one not written by Freud, but about Freud's analytic technique, and one by Freud himself on psychotherapy. Both of these papers are written at a crucial time in the genesis of psychoanalysis, kind of introducing the world to the methods Freud had been experimenting with. It gives deep historical context to the reason for the emergence of the method, and also the sort of antithesis or negation that the analytic method is working with. And I think that both of these papers are going to give us a interesting perspective on how to think method today. I know it's something that I have been thinking about more and more and more, is how we can learn, how we can develop new knowledge by focusing on not what we think, but how we're thinking, and the ways in which we experiment and play with method. Very small distinctions in method can lead to enormous breakthroughs in knowledge. So let's get into it. I'm gonna share my screen for the first paper, which is basically called a Psychoanalytic Procedure. All right, so if you guys can see the screen there, Psychoanalytic Procedure in Psychotherapy. Maybe I'll Oh. Now I'm having some problems. Oh no. I'm having problems. I can't move my screen, and I can't get out of this PowerPoint. I may have to stop the recording and start again.
Can you try and stop the share screen?
I can't move anything. Oh, what just happened? Okay, something. All right, so hopefully I'll be able to. I just don't know how to. Now I don't know how to. There we go. Now it's working all of a sudden. All right, sorry for that blip. Let's see if it's all right. Now it's working. Okay, so Freud's psychoanalytic procedure from 1904. This is an analysis of Freud's method by someone close to Freud himself. So he starts by saying that psychoanalysis is an outgrowth of the cathartic method. So the cathartic method is the method used by one of Freud's earliest collaborators, Joseph Breuer, in their studies on hysteria. And catharsis basically means, and you look into the etymology of the word catharsis, it's a word that means to cleanse or to purge. So you get this idea of a dirty subject. You get this idea of some toxicity, some negativity. The subject feels like it needs to get something out. That there's almost like you have a cancerous growth, or you have some sort of disease and you have to get it out. So psychoanalysis is an outgrowth of the application of the cathartic method, and the cathartic method involved hypnotizing patients and widening their consciousness. So you have this, and today we know this in the neurology and the neuroscience, as that our egos are structured by the constraints of the default mode network. So by hypnotizing patients, you get a method basically of what they're saying, widening consciousness, which in the neurological terms, you're releasing the subject from the constraints of the default mode network. And when you're widening the consciousness, you have the opportunity to confront symptoms, which basically emerge in intense emotions. So basically all of the ways in which the ego is constraining thought, and all the ways in which the ego is constraining perception, are loosened, and you have, as it were, other connections, other associations which are traumatic and which have been blocked or censored from consciousness, rising into consciousness. And these would emerge with intense emotions. And what was learned in the cathartic method is that usually people were not necessarily struggling with one single traumatic experience, but a series of traumatic experiences from their earlier time in life, which combine to create a symptom. So you could here sort of make this connection from our workshop last week, where we understood or approached how the dream work combines different ideas through processes of logically connecting different ideas into one superimposed symptom. And this is basically sort of what the cathartic method revealed, was that a series of traumatic experiences which were too difficult for the consciousness to accept were censored and blocked. And then through the hypnosis, you get them coming up to consciousness, and you can deal with these very intense, very raw experiences. Now it's going back. Okay, I get it right. There you go. So on the next slide here, we have analysis as different from the cathartic method as renouncing the suggestion of hypnosis, the suggestion in hypnosis. So in other words, instead of trying to lure the subject into a widening state of consciousness through hypnosis, like this is the hypnotist is sort of suggesting to the other subject this widening of consciousness through the hypnotic method. You just let the subject engage in free associations. So the free associations are the subject, instead of being hypnotized, the subject sort of submitting to this process of freely associating its own speech, and almost submitting to the process of, instead of engaging in voluntary thought and creating a coherent narrative of my history. So for me, for example, if you ask me about my past and I come up with a clear linear narrative of my past using the powers of my conscious ego, you're getting my ego's representation of the past. But free association works in a way where you just have to talk about your past almost without concern for a clear narrative, without concern for creating some constructed narrative, just to let your thoughts roam, let your thoughts connect as they will on their own accord. So for example, Freud would tell his patients to, quote, let himself go, or let themselves go. Don't use your ego to construct the narrative. Let yourself go and ramble at random about your past. I think this is really interesting, because usually when we hear about letting our ego go, letting our egos dissolve, it's in the context of getting away from speech. But Freud is here saying, get away from your ego identity and ramble at random and see what words, see what connections emerge from the unconscious. It's very interesting. So the only directive is to include everything that comes into your head, to not censor anything. And his claim is that when you apply this method, you just ramble at random, let yourself go, and you ramble about your history, is that you reveal huge gaps in your memory and causal connections where there's gaps. And it's in these gaps where Freud says the neuroses are being linked to amnesia. So there are, in other words, there's the hypothesis that in the subject, there are amnesic gaps of history which are linked to the neuroses, and which are sort of the structure of these gaps and the structure of this amnesia is the way it is, basically because the trauma or the negative excitation is too much for the ego to deal with, the contradictory ideas, the incompatible ideas. So they need to be censored in order for the ego to function basically. Whereas when these gaps, when this amnesia has been filled in through the free association, this is extremely disturbing for the ego, and because it's disturbing for the ego because it will mean the ego needs to dissolve and reintegrate. It will need to dissolve and reintegrate this new information which had been censored, which was too difficult to process. So his basic method is here, once you have recognized these gaps in the causal connections, you bring attention to these gaps, just pure attention, to the forgotten traumas. And this pathway will be structured by resistances, excuses, like that didn't happen, or that can't be true, or and so forth and so on. And the greater the Freud's formula is, the greater the resistance, the greater the distortion. So the more the ego is resisting this whole process of letting go, the more the ego is resisting this whole process of not using itself to create a manufactured narrative, but to sort of just say sort of the words and the thoughts as they just appear in the mind, is the location where the ego is going to fight its own cure and to keep the disease as it is. Because actually curing yourself will mean you have to change on a fundamental identity level. So what Freud's saying is basically he's putting a high level of emphasis and value on unintentional thoughts instead of intentional thoughts, which is for me very interesting because in the spiritual community, there's all this emphasis on intention, setting intentions. We have to set our intentions. But I think it's the opposite, that when you set your intentions, you're just reifying your ego as it is. Your ego is setting the intention. So there's a high value on the unintentional thoughts, which is the repressed material coming to consciousness. And that is the material you use to work the interpretation. So it seems to me like Freud is developing a method that is beyond what I would call spiritual bypassing, because it's the uncomfortable, it's the unpleasurable information, which is what's crucial for your intellectual or your spiritual and your intellectual development, authentic intellectual development. So his claim here is that hypnosis may conceal or evade resistances and obstruct insight into the play of psychical forces. So what I'm saying, how I'm interpreting this is that because hypnosis immediately takes the ego consciousness into the widened state of consciousness very quickly, that you are bypassing the mechanisms of resistance which you need to understand in order to get to the core trauma itself. And you need to go through those difficult steps. You need to go through those unpleasurable steps to basically reverse, basically to undo the work of the ego. Because the ego has already constructed this narrative as a defense against the gaps. So by hypnosis, you're going to the core, but you're not undoing the work that the ego was doing. So the work of analysis, again, back to the dream interpretation from the last workshop, the dream interpretation, you're undoing the dream work. And in typical psychoanalysis, you're undoing the work of the ego through the analysis. And that hypnosis could bypass this. So the basic formula in the end is that all repression and amnesia must be removed. And this is, quote, making unconscious accessible to consciousness. But this isn't understood. I want to make clear, because this is a great source. Actually, Dimitri, from a conversation I had with him this week, made me aware that I have to be clear here, is that making the unconscious accessible to consciousness doesn't mean that you're just like the iceberg model where now you're just fully conscious. It's like you're fully conscious of the iceberg underneath. It's not like that. It's that you're conscious of the unconscious. So you're never erasing the unconscious. It's just that the unconscious becomes more conscious. You're more aware of the presence of the unconscious. But the unconscious doesn't disappear. The unconscious is on the surface as well. The unconscious is on the surface as well, always playing a role in your development of your consciousness. It's just that you can work with the unconscious in a more real way, instead of the unconscious sort of throwing you around like a marionette. So there's also some sort of important limits that this author places on psychoanalysis, which Freud himself goes into in the paper we're going to do next, which is that the constitution of the patient sets a limit on the effectiveness of the psychoanalytic procedure. So I think this is where we have to be really innovative with method, because psychoanalytic method is not universal. In other words, the psychoanalytic method, a procedure, may not be able to help everyone in every situation. So he says that specifically, people who are in a very confused state, people in a very depressed state, even people of old age, and they used 50 and up, that these are limiting factors, because the procedure kind of requires that you are, one, have an elastic enough mind, that you are sort of cognitively capable of confronting your own neuroses before the procedure itself can be of highest effectiveness. Otherwise, there's going to be too many limiting factors. And he also says that effective treatment really takes 6 months to 3 years. So, and in the next paper, we're going to go deeper into what Freud thinks is kind of the downsides of the psychoanalytic method, which I think will be extremely interesting for us to talk about. But that is basically that. We have another guest I'm going to introduce here. So that was that paper. I'm going to sort of give maybe just my 2 takes on it, which is that, like, for me, it's very interesting to reflect on this paper, because as some of you know, I'm practicing at the intersection of psychedelics and psychoanalysis. And I wonder, because psychedelics have this same process of that they take your ego and they widen it. It basically destroys your ego. And so you can get to the core of the trauma very quickly. But I wonder if you bypass all of these little psychical forces that are necessary in the analysis to approach deeply. So I'm interested to talk about, like, how we should interpret sort of alternative methods, or how we should think about integrating the basic psychoanalytic method with these other mechanisms like hypnosis or like psychedelics or something like that. Because at the same time as the analytic method really helps you to undo the ego, at the same time it's very slow. It's limited in the sense that there are some people who are in too traumatized a state for it to really work. There are some people who are too old for it to really work. So in that situation, does mixing psychedelics or hypnosis into the analytic procedure something that widens the scope of psychoanalysis? Because for me, what I've been emphasizing in my own work is that psychedelics by themselves are not enough, that you need to have psychoanalysis coupled with it, and you have to have analysis that's outside of any hypnotic or psychedelic state to really, really get at the ego mechanisms. Because the suggestion in this paper and the next paper is that if you just do the widening of the ego to the widened non-egoic state, the oceanic consciousness, you could say, that alone is not strong enough to ensure that the ego symptoms don't reform. In my experience, the ego symptoms reform. So you could have a hugely powerful hypnotic session, or you could have a hugely powerful psychedelic session, and you could see your deepest trauma and think that you're healed. But don't underestimate the power of the ego to reform and to come back even with a vengeance. So yeah, let's talk about it.
I could maybe start. Can you hear me, Paul?
Yeah, you're coming through. Yeah, you're coming.
Right. So I'm not a practitioner of any kind of therapeutic procedure, but in a sense, I can appreciate how difficult it really is to discuss any form of therapy, and that's basically what I get from these readings. I mean, I have familiarized myself to some degree with the current psychological and kind of scientific psychological thinking. So if we read these papers from the contemporary viewpoint, there's so much stuff going on that still today we cannot reconcile with. I mean, they seem like kind of human universals in a way, since we can encounter the same kind of criticisms. I mean, from the viewpoint that Freud is discussing, the same kind of criticisms he discusses here are almost exactly the same wording that some contemporary psychologists would launch at Freudianisms. So the main thing I get here is perhaps the fact that we begin from repression and not from the idea that there is some kind of easy to go methods that can bypass all negative thoughts, which perhaps hypnosis represented for the earlier paradigm.
I think to me that what stands out in this method as both its strength and like the source of a lot of its criticism is, and of course from egos, the criticism comes from egos always, is that it's unpleasant. There's no way around, there's no bypassing that. Undoing the work that the ego has done is an unpleasant process. You have to deal with the real of the negative thoughts in a way that's unsettling. You can't just you can't just with your positive thinking, like I'm depressed. Well, think positively.
Yeah.
You can't do it. You can't do it.
In a way, Freud starts off with the same assumption, but in a completely different manner that some spiritual communities start with, that they need to cleanse the soul. I mean, in Greek context, someone who was considered filthy or stained by some kind of miasma or some social negativity, they were basically justified to throw these people out from the community. So it's a big threat to have some kind of stigma of negativity within one's own soul. So basic starting point is kind of the same as some spiritual communities have, like we need to cleanse our soul. And yeah,
it's interesting because I've been reading, like last time we referred to Osho several times also, and he speaks very much against like the psychoanalytic method, but he speaks very much in the same like using the language of yeah, how should I say, like describing the problem. But it's very interesting because he also says that like the methods like the yogic methods developed, was developed for innocent people. So he actually used different psychoanalytic methods. I don't know exactly what, but he did it because he said that he needed more of a clean slate because people were so loaded with drama.
Yeah, in my understanding of Osho, he said he needed to introduce new methods of meditation, which were more active meditation, because the modern people were so neurotic, basically. Were so neurotic that they were so out of touch with their body that they needed the bodily active meditation.
Yeah.
They couldn't, and what you're describing with he was against psychoanalytic method, I think that most people who look into it see the same problem, but we disagree with how to go about dealing with it.
Yeah, but I came to think about it because you like the idea that you can unchain the symptom more, but you're still presented with the problem of building new baggage afterwards. That's also what he talks about, but then you need, according to him, you need meditation to step out of even collecting all the trash.
Isn't there like a really big difference between Freud and Osho? Since I think that there is something that we need to really recognize here. That it came up already, but well, in Osho, I think it's similar that one needs to sort of similar to Zen Buddhism. I think that one needs to somehow bring one's thoughts home and be within oneself somehow satisfied in a deeper way than is recognized in ordinary consciousness. But their conception of freedom is completely different here. I think that there's genuine difference, and the difference is that Freud's technique is characteristically modern, since he recognizes freedom basically in our speech and not in our being. I think that the way that yogic people talk about freedom, it's just freedom of being and not freedom of discussing things in a civilized and cultured manner.
Yeah, it's basically like freedom from the body and freedom from the mind, as I understand it.
Yeah.
But in answer to your question, Cadell, about supplementing the psychoanalytic method with other methodologies, I think there's been a bit of work done on that, and certainly, I think certainly some psychoanalysts are, trying to integrate EMDR, which is a hypnotic form of treatment for PTSD. But I think that what's essential about the psychoanalytic method is the presence of two subjectivities, so two egos, and the tension. So the relationship and the tension that other subject, as the analyst, kind of produces, is very important. You can't analyze yourself, and you have to be analyzed by a psychoanalyst. And what I mean by a psychoanalyst is somebody who's able to obviously have, as Freud said in the last bit of his paper, I've highlighted it here, said in the last bit of the paper, something about the analyst needs to have been able to kind of work through their own repressions, so having had their own analysis, but also something around, I wonder if the tension is necessary. So in a kind of a way, it's almost like the tension between the conscious and the unconscious is replicated or is also takes place, the tension between the two egos. So if we talk about resistance and transference, you know, the analyst's job is to kind of work with the resistance. So I actually think I don't know, like I actually think the good thing about the psychoanalytic method is that it actually focuses on tension and on reducing tension or releasing tension by removing repressions and integrating, but it will never stop. However, does it lead to some development? I mean, having had a lot of my own analysis, I would say that certainly I'm not the person I was 10 years ago. I don't know, but I just think, yeah, it's something about, yeah, it's.
I think it's interesting. I mean, because when you think about the spiritual gurus, there is also a tension between like a spiritual master and like, for example, Osho had the sannyasins, like that there's some sort of dyadic tension between the master and the servant. Of course, Hegel's dialectic is this dialectic of master and servant in some sense. And I think that the difference between the psychoanalyst and the spiritual guru is the analyst is kind of this empty subject. You know, like the analyst doesn't tell the subject anything, like doesn't tell the analyst anything necessarily. Like you're saying, the job of the analyst is kind of to work with the resistances, that is to help the analyst and not cover up the ego resistances. So you're kind of trying to, every time the ego comes back to try to create a clear narrative, every time the ego comes back to resist what's going on, the analyst is going to try to point again in the direction of the unconscious symptoms and point again in the direction of what's trying to be brought to consciousness. And I think that focusing on that technique and with the razor sharp focus that I think Freud was focusing on that technique, I think that it's sometimes bypassed among the spiritual gurus to sort of identify with me as a guru. Even if that's unconscious, in the guru. And I wonder if that's kind of the distinction that we need to focus on, which Mika brought up as the pre-modern yogic focus is on the freedom of being, but not on the freedom of speech, which is in a very kind of almost sneaky way, I would think, trying to link the subject's speech with identity to the guru. You know, like you're not free in your speech because really your speech is being regulated still by the Zizek, I guess, would say the big other of tradition.
For me, it's also, I really find, I'm very new to psychoanalysis, but I find it extremely helpful, like the language. I mean, to even be able to articulate the unfreedom, that is the word of freedom, I mean, is so empty in some sense. And how do we speak about the unfreedom? So I find it extremely helpful, like language-wise, psychoanalysis, but I'm not sure of the healing method or whatever we should call it, but.
Go ahead, Roshana.
Well, I just think that what it does, I mean, there's two things. Is it that it's releases tension, but then tension reforms, and releases tension reforms? Or is there some developmental kind of trajectory in terms of, if we think about it, about the becoming of ourselves? So becoming, you know, kind of knowing yourself more. And in knowing yourself more, I suppose one word for it is maturity. I don't know. Because there's such a thing as maturity.
Absolutely. I think what you're saying is so important. So the tension doesn't go away. But I think I think that that's consistent with the contemporary philosophical analyses of the importance of the death drive, which is that we actually want to keep maintaining tension. We don't want to have no tension. But the point of the analysis of the releasing tension is that you want to be released from tensions of the pathological past. Like you don't want to be, you don't want your unconscious of like something that happened to you as a child, or you don't want the unconscious of something, even the conditions of your, like for me, what's important is even the conditions of your birth itself, that I was born.
Yeah.
You don't want this unconscious to be preventing you from taking ownership of the unconscious, responsibility for the unconscious in the present moment, because the unconscious doesn't go away. It's just that you can become more conscious in the way you work with the unconscious, and you can be less, the power of the unconscious to throw you around, as it were, from basically things that haven't been worked out in your own history as a subject, give you the possibility to direct new tensions. Like, so, like take, for example, Osho as a historical subject. Osho as a historical subject in his performativity developed enormous tensions by creating a community in Portland, Oregon and stuff like that. He developed tensions with the whole community. He developed tensions with the United States of America. He developed tensions with Christianity. He developed tensions with our sexual performativity. But those were all tensions that emerged from his free speech as a subject, not something that was anything that could be reduced to his past.
Connecting with the difference between then Osho and Freudian psychoanalysis, I would like to add that there is one perhaps more crucial difference, namely money. I mean, the traditional yogic guru or the master in Osho, or some kind of spiritual master that we perhaps naturally try to seek in our natural orientation. Perhaps we could go more about why do we seek for some kind of master figure. But overall, I think it's a crucial difference then when in the traditional way, one just seeks for a master with whom one can identify, and then one, as it were, from one's own free will, starts paying or starts giving gifts to the traditional master. But in Freud, this is really different, since in a way he's trying to produce some kind of a clinic or some kind of neutral platform where one can work with one's mental disturbances without having to identify too much with the narrative.
But then the contradiction is there that, I mean, going to sessions every week for I don't know how many years, you could look at economic incentives there as well.
Yeah, it's recognized from the South. Yeah, but I think that it's a really crucial difference.
But you see, Freud said 3 years, 6 months to 3 years. But this is a good example of the pathologization that happens. Modern capitalists, all of that stuff, professionalization, analysis can go on for 20 years, 4 or 5 times a week.
I think Lacan was very critical of this. Famously, Lacan was like we could have a 5-minute session or we could have a 5-hour session. It's all on the timing of your unconscious.
Yeah.
He was operating on what he called logical time of the unconscious. So and Lacan resisted any standardization, like 6 months to 3 years. Like he didn't have it, because I think he was very focused, and this is very characteristic of Lacan, is like the idiosyncrasies of each subject. I think that's interesting. But I think also like I think Mads is right to bring up the contradiction, and I think Mika is also right to bring up the difference between the traditional yogic and what Freud's trying to do. And I think we have to sort of we have to be critical of Freud and psychoanalysis, but I think we also have to be respectful of the innovational difference in psychoanalysis vis-a-vis spiritual masters. I think so. So it's a very interesting contradiction to work with.
Definitely, definitely. I'm also not on one side or the other.
Yeah, no, you're just bringing up the contradiction.
Yeah.
And I think that it's crucial. It's one also that I wonder about, you know, like, you know, for me, I almost feel like I would like analysis to be very open-ended, but at the same time, I don't want me as an analyst to become unconsciously some master figure where where their identity is dependent on me. And what scared me the most about that happening is actually in Freud's own Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he identifies the death drive in that moment where he thinks that the patient is ready to leave. He thinks the patient has finished his or her analysis, but that something very dark emerges in the separation from the analyst as a master figure. Something demonic emerges because there was a transference there. There was a love transference there that happened unconsciously. And it's kind of like that negativity of losing your master figure brings up a whole new bunch of symptoms. Kind of like probably the way in which the Osho's community had to go through a purge when Osho left. You know, because the master figure is gone, and now our whole psychic universe is you know, destabilized. So there's a weird paradox, like, where how do you develop, because psychoanalysis to me is the ultimate anti-master discourse. It's like the anti-master discourse, because it's anti-master because the principle is it's your free associations. So the analyst isn't the master and your ego isn't the master. It's your unintentional free associations. And at the same time, the analyst is, like in Lacan's Four Discourses, the analyst is kind of the subtractive subject, the empty subject. And is there a way in which that empty figure becomes the master in some weird way?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think in reality, that's what does happen. So in a way, the ending of the analysis is a process in itself where the master has to be brought down. So it's very painful finishing because you become the master.
Yeah, and Rashanik, in your practice, how do you deal with that?
Well, it's interesting because endings are very kind of different. Like there is kind of ruptures, like, you know, like people just don't come anymore, you know, they just stop because they don't know how to end, or they don't want it, or it's too painful to end, or change isn't happening according to what they're kind of wanting, or they're failing the treatment. So for example, somebody's drinking and they're seeing me and they keep relapsing. And even though I kind of say, okay, we just keep going. It's not about, you don't have to stop for me. We just have to keep talking. But they feel like they're failing the treatment. So I think, I think every ending is kind of hard because it's almost, you will never see this person again. Because you can't become friends with your analysts.
Does it require you to be a kind of a monster in a way?
It might feel that way. Like, yeah, well, it's almost like, it's a weirdest relationship. I've had four analyses myself. And I would say that the first one took a year to finish and it was agreed and planned. The second and the third was like disagree or clash. And I'm in my fourth one and I'm not ending yet. But sometimes you don't want to end. Like some people die with, like the analyst dies, or they die. Because you don't want to end.
I think the thing that I keep thinking about philosophically is people have such a hard time with ends. When something, and we have such a hard time with ends, and it brings me to, in my conversation with Todd McGowan this week, the wisdom and the value in becoming friends with death and loss. Like always already, like what I said this week in my men's circle was, I act as if I'm already dead. So I already inscribed the catastrophe at the beginning, and this provoked enormous ego resistance from them. The idea that I could live my life this way was seen as cold, heartless, mean and cruel, hopeless, and in some sense, yes, in some way, but it's the reality I'm dealing with. Like I've come to that conclusion because of the pathology of the end that seems to be a feature of human psychology. It's kind of like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Like you can live with the image that things aren't going to end, but you know damn well things are going to end. So why not just accept the brutal reality? And maybe it's not so brutal. I just accept it. I don't know.
To me, it seems like you're coming from the viewpoint of the tragedy. I think that there is also another viewpoint of the comedy.
Well, but that's what I say. But accepting the tragedy opens up the possibilities of the comedy. Because I accept the tragedy, now I can enjoy.
Exactly.
That's my logic. I don't know.
I sometimes think about the US as a great example of a culture where they do not accept tragedy. Like failure is not accepted.
Failure is not an option, you know.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, especially, I like Todd McGowan's lectures on the death drive here is that in some sense, what's really at stake in a mature ego is learning how to lose well, learning how to fail well, not pretending that you'll never fail or not pretending that you'll never lose. Because like, for me, like, it's obvious what my ego does, which is I always want to stage a scene where I win everything. It's my ego does that, and it's staged, and even my ego wants to live forever, but that's a silly thought. That to be immortal, that's a contradiction. You push immortality to the end, and it's obviously a contradiction there somewhere. You know, so to me, if I accept limitation, if instead of pretending and I'm in a fantasy that everything that I am right now is going to continue forever indefinitely, that I win, that to accept already that, okay, I have a time and that time will end, then it seems like that's a psychological mechanism where I can explore more freely somehow. Is that logic? Does that logic resonate somehow?
Totally.
But you're clearly not very, very, very neurotic.
Well, that's the thing that I also like you don't seem like you're really like caught with gaps or inconsistencies in your daily life as some so-called normal person should be.
Well,
I mean, when I figure what kind of life do we lead, usually it's basically filled with negativities and inconsistencies, and that's something that has been bothering me very much for many years. That it seems that most of our daily existence is that some semi-automatic reactions to negative images or negative consequences that we project but never really face. So if we think about what kind of person would be a highly neurotic, like normal person, well, perhaps it would be a she who would be fixated in her daily life on some really small and minuscule operations that bring some kind of Sartrean negative ecstasy in really condensed and so small proportions, but never getting into any kind of really fulfilling work. So basically what we are, I think, trying to reconcile intellectually when reading Freud is that we need to find some kind of pathway or some kind of way. Well, Freud talks of libidos, that's some kind of river that we need to find a way for it to work in our life. But basically the problem is that we also fixate on the things that bring us more misery and deepen our neurotic anxiety all the time. So there is a propensity in us to go into negative things, even when we are really like trying to be good to ourselves, trying to care for ourselves, trying to be open-minded and just be free or whatever. So it's a problem of psychical economy in a way. What brings us sexual satisfaction in our daily life? What kind of outlets do we find? I mean, the kind of patients that Freud discusses, they're really hardcore in a way, but basically you can derive some kind of model of the person that is fixated on some kind of negative ecstasies. And the way I see it, I mean, I'm living with a woman, and I think that I'm in a way a normal neurotic person, but I perhaps am a bit more obsessional than the normal folk. But basically the situation resembles a kind of the normal, I mean, Oedipal situation where you live with, try to live the normal life in current situation. It's kind of like a medieval torture device, you know, the kind of like contraction where you are put into tightening like ropes, and every time you move a little bit, the contraction gets a bit tighter and it makes more pain come through every time you try to make freedom for yourself. So this, I think, connects with the discussion about masters, since I think that in our normal, like natural way of proceeding in our life, we are seeking for some kind of norm or law. And when I'm a man in a relationship, I think that perhaps the natural way of the woman is try to seek for God or law. I mean, not in any explicit manner from the man, and man becomes a kind of a figure for law, and this kind of narrative fixates and gets stuck too deep into the soul. So basically we start to get stuck into compulsions and perhaps get addicted to cigarettes or, I don't know, football or chewing gum or whatever. And these are issues that we deal with in our everyday life, but they're really difficult to talk about. I don't know if there is a point here, but
I think that's genius. I think what you I just think that just so useful what you just said. I think it was so brilliantly described. I specifically like your metaphor of the medieval torture device. Oh my goodness, that was hilarious, but so thought-provoking. I mean, I do think that what's come up for me, and I do want to move on to the next paper soon, but I do think it's worth saying that there's a way in which Freud starts his work by being interested in the relationship between parent and child and the relationship between devoted love partners, and that this is kind of the seat of the neuroses. And I do think, you know, I often run through the thought experiment of what would hunter-gatherers say if we went to hunter-gatherers and said, like real hunter-gatherers, like way back, and we said, what we decided to do with adults is we decided to take one man and one woman, and we decided to put them in the same house for decades and just let them figure it out. I think hunter-gatherers would be like, What the heck? What that's insane. It's like, how did you decide to build a society that way? Like, I think that the way in which we manufacture this neuroses and demand it and to repeat it is very strange. And any loosening of the structure, like in a pragmatic way, is not approached with any maturity. It's either we have the nuclear family and we bind ourselves together like neurotic, obsessional, crazy people, or we have individualistic, polyamorous free-for-all, where sex is reduced to a market phenomenon. And it's like, is there not some mature conversation here where like there's an alternative to that two options? It's like it's like where like we have to deal, to me, with the problem of we have to reproduce our species, and we simultaneously want everyone in the society to be able to build healthy, mature, loving relationships.
Yeah.
How do we do that?
And something that doesn't fit into the picture is the idea of starting to just ramble on about things really incoherently and disconnectedly. That's something that we do not have a place for in our normal life, since every kind of instance of starting to just associate things in the way that Freud says that we should do, it really is a threat. It's a danger. It's somebody who goes on about things without any consideration about the situation. I think that we should be perhaps justified into throwing them out from normal civilized connections. And when I read this philosophically, I then think that perhaps the idea that when reading somebody like Zizek with my philosopher friends, the main idea that they resist is the fact that why should we just start deconstructing our narrative identity? I mean, what's the value? Why should I go through that kind of shit? I don't want to. But it's a difficult idea to convey by any criteria, that there should be some value about not identifying with our own narrative. Well, when you were discussing, talking about hunter-gatherers, I also picture my like farmer godfather, my father's brother, who is really old-fashioned patriarch in a big farm. And the way I picture his idea of my like neurotic life, I'm a philosopher who likes to discuss. I mean, basically, I think that when he would see me discussing even things, he would say that this is gay or this is stupid, stop doing that and go to the farm so that you don't get neurotic. And Freud didn't think that these kind of people who were working with their hands and so on, they were not neurotic for him.
Yeah, working, like for the mind to be working with the body is, to me, now a non-negotiable part of my day-to-day life. And even that was before I became an academic, I was playing sports all day. Like, and that was very, I think I was pretty well adjusted to my own existence, not to the world. It's not about adjusting and fitting into the world, as we're going to get to in the next paper, but being able to exist. You know, like I exist somehow, not in a ridiculous way that I am substantial or something, but that I have the capacity to enjoy my existence somehow. And I do get that from being with the body, but I also don't want to get rid of my mind and my intellectual activity. I think it has to also be a part of the process.
But if you had to go and get water, like walk 5 kilometers to get water and then carry the water back, and then maybe, shoot an animal for the dinner to bring home to your wife and children, you wouldn't be sitting thinking about any of these things. it's about survival, like that, hence the hunter-gatherer.
But I think it's good that you brought up this gap, because I think it's precisely, this is our privilege. Like, it's our privilege, like psychoanalysis, we're privileged to be aware of this psychoanalysis. We're privileged to confront these problems. And so for me, I see alienation as a positive thing, that most people in the past didn't have time to be alienated.
Well, is it possible, is it possible that they would still have feelings, they would still feel, you know, stuff, but yeah, they wouldn't labor over it, they wouldn't obsess over it, because their attention is needed elsewhere, and maybe they are harmonized more with the environment, with nature, because they're in nature. Like we got everything kind of, yeah. Is it a privilege though?
I think
It's a curse.
I think that's a real misunderstanding today. I have a feeling that a lot of people think that in the future, when we will not have to work so much because of computers and so on, that everything will be fine. I think the totally opposite.
Absolutely. I said that in a recent presentation. I said that leftists who think basic income is just going to bring utopia is like it's just going to bring all of our psychical baggage. It's like
it's gonna be a shit show.
Yeah. The way I picture this one is that either farm work or baseball or Hegelian philosophy. That's basically the option.
Farm work, baseball, or Hegelian philosophy. This is our
That's a dream.
This is our new triad. So without any, we'll go. I want to have enough time to go to the next paper, which is actually Freud's paper, and then we'll discuss that again. So I'll try to get through that. Let me share my screen again. Let's see. All right, so this one is called On Psychotherapy from 1905, written by Freud. So again, we're focusing on methods. So he says, you know, analysis, we introduced a new method for treating neuroses and that it's struggling to get recognition. So we're seeing Freud here right at a time where he's trying to institutionalize psychoanalysis, trying to make sort of the general psychotherapy scientific community aware of this method and its potential value. And he's saying that the perception of psychoanalysis at this moment, which I think is still maybe the perception of psychoanalysis, is that it's mysticism and unscientific, and that it's searching for meaning where there's no meaning, and that it's sort of a pseudo method, a pseudo approach to solving the problems of the neuroses. So Freud here has some interesting comments on first defending even the practice of psychotherapy. It's clear, I think, in Freud's early writings, that he's very aware that his psychoanalytic method is here embedded in a long history of psychotherapy, and that psychotherapy is, he quote, an ancient form. And I think it's interesting how he describes the ancient form of psychotherapy. He said it was about curing expectations colored by faith. I think that's so interesting to focus on. What is that? People get expectations, things that don't exist, and then they have faith in this, and then they become sick because of their own expectations. So that's very interesting. I'd like to go into that a little deeper later. He also defends psychotherapy not because he is proposing this psychotherapy, but because he says people demand therapy, and that we merely as physicians need to maturely say, if people are demanding therapy, we have the responsibility to mature the craft, to become self-reflective. this is kind of linked, I think, to what Rashanik was saying in some ways, that the physician, he says the physician, we might say the analyst, plays a big role in the whole process. And that the analyst here, the tension between the two, that the analyst has the responsibility, or the physician has the responsibility, to include themselves self-reflectively in the very act of the therapeutic process. So he emphasizes what we covered in the last, then he goes on to emphasize what we emphasized in the last paper on this transition from the cathartic to the analytic. And he says that the emphasis from the cathartic to the analytic was emphasized purely by subjective motive, again, playing with the psychical forces instead of bypassing the psychical forces, actually undoing the ego work. And that he says this penetrates the most deeply. So again, that's a nice phallic metaphor. It's like an anti-master's discourse. It penetrates the most deeply and carries the furthest effect. So I think we talk about it in the next slide, that the difference between analytic and hypnotic therapy is that he's skeptical of the power of suggestion because the ego resistances will come back. He's skeptical of the hypnotic therapy because you bypass all of the ego defenses that you need to work through. There's no bypassing that. So basically you avoid ego resistance and the patient clings to their disease, as it were. So the next point he makes is that there's an erroneous impression of analysis, and that it's searching for the origins of the pathology and removing it is easy. He says that this is very difficult to do. Well, he's very isolating very clearly what it is that's going on. Searching for the origins of the pathology, removing it, is that requires a very precise technique. Basically, he's saying that psychotherapists are sloppy with technique. That it's kind of like and maybe that there's a way in which therapy of the mind can be sloppier than, for example, a surgeon with the body. Because if you're a surgeon with the body and you're trying to remove something from the body, you can't be sloppy. You're working with material that you can see. You know, if you're trying to remove something from the liver or the stomach and you're operating in the arm, like that's sloppy. Like you're not operating where you have to be operating. Whereas for the mind, it's easier to be sloppy almost. Like it's easier, you know, like it's not as concrete as the body, so to speak. So he says, then introduces the downsides of analysis. So critical of his own practice, critical of his own method, and I think deeply critical. He says, look, it's slow. This analytic method is slow. Resistance is unpleasant, and you're working with resistance of the ego. That it's creating huge time and energy demands on both the patient and the physician. We're talking about a long periods of analysis, of working through lots of unpleasant emotions. And that you're working in relationship not to people who are well adjusted, but people who are, quote, unfit for existence itself. This is crucial. He's not talking about people who are unfit for the world. Like, it's not about adapting the ego to the world, but it's about being unfit for existence itself. You just want to leave existence. So you're working with very dark people. You're working with people who are in a very difficult place. So all of these are the downsides of psychoanalysis, and so how do we think through these? Do we just have to go through this? You know, like that's basically what he's suggesting in some way. He also identifies conditions that prevent analysis. And these conditions are interesting because they also speak to Lacan's hypothesis that psychoanalysis could only have existed in the scientific universe, that psychoanalysis could only have existed in the modern world, because he's saying that what prevents analysis is low education, low character. You have to be someone who's built up a certain educational level. You have to be someone who's built up a certain character level, or else there's no point to go into it. He also says people in a degenerate mental condition. So if you have some like he's not against that the body has an effect on the mind. So like if you literally have a neurological disorder, like for example, Alzheimer's, that there's no point to go under analysis if you have Alzheimer's. There's just no point. It's the mental condition is not workable. He also emphasizes old age, but I think that what's more important than old age is the lack of elasticity, which is not necessarily old age, although of course that's more probable. That a young mind, and he says the opposite for the young mind, that the young mind is too impressionable. So there's no point to have an analysis of maybe people who are in their teens still developing. That your basically analysis is for adults, but also for adults that are still have an elastic plasticity of their mind. And also he said analysis is not good for people who need an immediate cure, like people who are suicidal, like this moment. Like, because it takes time, and if you're working with someone who's in that state of mind, the analysis might even put them even further in a suicidal state. So basically he's saying, in short, that analysis is in some sense a privileged person's concern. It's for highly developed people. That's the weird paradox, is that analysis is a method and an approach that is helping privileged developed people learn how to continue pushing the frontiers of their mind even further and further and further, even ways that most people, like we were talking about just before, wouldn't even consider this as a problem. So the conditions for the psychoanalytic method are that unconscious ideas have a direct cause to morbid symptoms, and that bringing the unconscious to conscious, again, not getting rid of the unconscious, but bringing the unconscious to conscious, corrects the deviation of being controlled by the past. That doesn't mean you get rid of deviation, but you uplift, he says, and this is his words, you uplift the compulsion. You don't get rid of the compulsion, you uplift the compulsion. The compulsion becomes more conscious. But it's still there, it's still a deviation, you're still working with tension, but in a more conscious way. He even goes as far as saying that psychoanalysis is, quote unquote, a re-education on internal resistances. This is, I think, linked to what Mika was saying in a way in a previous workshop about how Freud had a unique way of overcoming his own internal blocks. And that this method is something that he's trying to institute to help everyone else also try to approach the same thing. You know, the thing that's darkest, the thing that's most disturbing to me, that is very easily projected outside. We see that now. I think this is a social ideological pandemic of people projecting the darkest thing inside themselves outside. So re-education on this internal resistance is something that's needed, because the unconscious ideas and impulses are, quote unquote, more dangerous when they're unconscious than when they're lifted to a higher level of self-reflectivity. When they're lifted to a higher level of self-reflectivity, all of a sudden, those incestuous killing drives, all of those deepest, darkest drives are not as dangerous as they were. So another interesting thing, and I thought this was so important to think about, is that Freud is very nuanced with the way he handles sexuality. He says that there's a major conflict of the mind, and it's not solved by just let's have more sex. So Freud cannot be linked to a priori promiscuous culture. He's not saying that more sex solves the problem of civilization constraining sexuality. What he says is that we have a need for sex and love, and that the lack of the ability to do that, the lack of the ability to be sexual when we have the need for it, and the lack of the ability to love when we have the need for it, is what causes the repression and a breakout of illness. So again, it's very subtle, very nuanced. What he's saying is that we have, is that what civilization hasn't done a good enough job of dealing with is that we do have real needs on the level of sexuality, and we do have real needs on the level of love. And if we do not have the capacity to enact those things in a real healthy way, we get into repression and a breakout of symptoms. So that's, I think, the crucial point there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And maybe before we break it out, I'll just say, I think that this is a super important way for us to identify both the historical conditions that made psychoanalysis relevant and also the limitations of the method. Where can we think innovatively? And also, what is the real problem is highly developed minds. I think we're all like all the people here are kind of the same in that situation. We're all we're well-educated, well-meaning people. We're developing our intellects and so forth. And we're having problems with the libidinal body, probably, that we are wondering how to be exploring the potentials, the far end potentials of our mind, while also accepting the reality of what it means to be a body and live in a society in a very unique historical condition, a very strange historical condition. So if anyone wants to jump in, feel free. We could just we can riff now for the next 30 minutes or so. I think it's very interesting the way you frame sex and love.
Yeah, it's really crucial. I think that there's something really important about recognizing sexuality in this way. And it's something that even the contemporary psychologists would reproach Freud for. I mean, he focuses too much on sexuality. I mean, I've heard this really too many times. Yeah. And also, I have some idea about what kind of thing does Freud represent, or what does psychoanalysis stand for the kind of mainstream psychologists today. I mean, I think that it's in a way, I mean, the very name Freud, or the signifiers psychoanalysis, it's a signifier for the modern contemporary psychologists to allow some kind of mysticism. It allows some kind of really unscrupulous thinking for them. I have witnessed this too many times, that they start to posit some really stupid stuff right after just bringing Freud or bringing psychoanalysis into discussion. And it's, when we read Freud here, I mean, he's really way more rigorous with everything he says.
Yeah, he's rigorous. I have to admit, though, I'm amused by this sort of general idea of Freud that some people just like suck too much to be an analysis. That's like analysis is for cool people, cool people only. But I still have a question sort of left over from the other paper, but it goes into this one, this idea that we're bringing the unconscious into consciousness, because I'm actually surprised to find this phrasing, because for some reason, I don't know, maybe this was Zizek, but I don't know who I got this from, but I have some sort of like suspicion of this idea. And I know, Cadell, you mentioned you had some sort of conversation with Dimitri about that. So, and I feel like what a lot of people have been saying has sort of like been touching upon that. But I'm curious about sort of like a re-articulation of that, or indeed, what are other modalities that sort of attach themselves to this idea of bringing the unconscious to consciousness that don't seem to work, where the sort of the Freudian method seems to sort of get around that issue. I really like this other phrasing that in the paper in terms of re-education, which makes sense to me. But I guess I just wanted to throw that out there as a vague question or whatever.
I think it's a precise question.
Yeah, it's good.
I think it's a precise question, and it's something that I think about as well, and I want to get it right. It's like, I think at least, okay, so speaking, because you brought up Zizek, speaking from Zizek's perspective, I think he's against this image, this popular image of the iceberg model, where the unconscious is the iceberg beneath the surface and our egos are the consciousness above the surface. And he's against this idea that we can bring the whole iceberg into consciousness. This type of thing, like making all the unconscious conscious. I think what they emphasize, and I think this is from Lacan especially, and I think Lacan interpretation of Freud, is that the unconscious is also on the surface. The unconscious just isn't in the depths. That repression isn't just in the depths, that repression also operates on the surface. And that the unconscious ideas, like Freud says in this paper, are more dangerous when they're unconscious on the surface. It's that, and so by undergoing the psychoanalysis, I don't think you're eliminating the unconscious, because I think the unconscious is irreducible, but you're more conscious of your unconscious. And by being more conscious of your unconscious, this is my interpretation, I don't know if I'm right, but you're less being thrown around by gaps in your own historical traumas, and you're more capable of dealing with the tensions of the present as it actually is. Because what I've seen a lot of people is the way they're viewing the present moment is through the lens of their unconscious trauma of the past. And they're not capable of actually seeing the present moment. But there are unconscious tensions in the present moment. It's just that people can't see them because they're filtering them through their unconscious history. And that might even be the case for our society as a whole. Like if you think about the contemporary political sphere, what I see are people viewing the present tensions from the point of view of 20th century ideology. So they'll view contemporary political tensions through the 20th century ideas of fascism and communism. Whereas we need new ideas of the tensions as they exist today, and that requires a new thinking of the unconscious tensions. Does that make sense?
That's very helpful. Yeah, I'm wondering if it's accurate at all to say you're sort of, I want to avoid saying gaining knowledge, but sort of coming into figuring out what these unconscious processes are. Like I'm gaining knowledge of some sort of process that's going on with me now that's going to root me in the present more. Because I sort of hear you saying, and correct me if I'm sort of misunderstanding you, but that you were being sort of freed from the past in a particular way. And I'm curious how you would relate this to the way Zizek talks about retroactivity and about this sort of, I'm going to change in some significant way because I readjust or I reinterpret the past in a particular way.
My understanding of both the psychological time which is explicit in Freud, from when we covered the paper Screen Memories, for example, and the type of time that Zizek talks about philosophically as that the past is a virtual present. Like the past isn't the actual past that actually happened, but it's a virtual past that is holding the subject in the present moment. And that through analysis, you can reinterpret the story you're telling yourself about the past. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. Thank you.
About this notion of the unconscious, I would like to also point out that Freud is absolutely right in saying that it's not the same as the philosophical notion of unconscious. I think that one of the perhaps most well-known first articulations of the unconscious is from Gottfried Leibniz, who had a notion of like unconscious as some sort of small or tiny or very minuscule perceptions. For example, when one perceives an ocean, one sees the whole ocean but doesn't perceive directly all the variations on the small waves or the details. So Leibniz's unconscious is perhaps the very perception of everything, like those very minuscule factors that are acting in our perception. So I think that it's not the same as Freudian unconscious. And perhaps one way to approach it would be, from philosophical side, would be, well, Edmund Husserl was perhaps one of the most influential philosophers of last century. He introduced the transcendental phenomenology as a method for some kind of scientific stance towards reality, which revolutionized the way that we view all phenomena. So what Husserl does, he acts out a kind of reduction of whole of reality, so that one doesn't anymore act in a natural manner, but feels bracketed away from reality, or is subtracted as a subject from reality. So the way I see in Husserl unconscious is, I would ask from Husserl, why do you do it? What's the reason for acting out this reduction? I mean, I'm not questioning the fact that one can do a transcendental reduction of reality. I'm just asking, why do it? Why are you doing it? Here, I think that Husserl would be sort of caught with his pants down. He would not have an answer, and he would require to have some kind of working through of some kind of mental blockade, or some kind of, I don't know, some kind of issues that are going on, which are totally unrelated to his scientific practice of trying to adequately describe the whole phenomenal reality. It's the very idea that there is some kind of unknown force that compels you to act out again and again the same reduction with the same results, and there be some kind of reason for doing it. I think this is the way that I relate to it, but I don't know.
I mean, I think your description of Leibniz's unconscious is kind of, to me, the ultimate fantasy of the reductionist mind, to be able to see all the small to be able to see the atoms, to be able to see the quantum fluctuations.
Yeah, I mean, Leibniz was totally crazy. He was perhaps the most insane philosopher ever. I mean, he had the idea that you could just have one proposition and then derive the whole of reality from it. Ideal language.
There's the ideal to me, the scientific ego is driven by the desire for the meta language, for the language to complete language, for the language that would cover the whole field of language, for the language that would finally find the master signifier or the other signifier.
Yeah, the unconscious would be in asking, why do it? Why are you doing it?
What's the connection for you between Husserl's unconscious and Leibniz's unconscious?
They are, I think, in the same paradigm as philosophers. They're trying to establish some kind of more rigorous view of reality in a rationalist manner.
Whereas I think the Freudian unconscious goes goes pretty well, in my view, with Hegel's notion of negativity. And, to me, I'm intrigued. If anyone has read, I would be interested. I'm intrigued at Zizek's provocation that he says Schelling already describes the unconscious in Ages of the World. I've yet to read the book myself, but that he basically says that Schelling discovers the sort of gap in being, the pre-logical heart, something like that, already in the Ages of the World, and that this is massively influential, of course, to Hegel, so that there's already this logical connection between what happens in German idealism and what happens in Freudian psychoanalysis. And it's almost that, you know, this linkage is probably lost because Hegel's too difficult to read, and for most people they don't bother, and probably Freud didn't even read Hegel. And maybe it's good, you know, like sometimes I think it's good that Freud and Lacan are anti-philosophers, because it's almost that their anti-philosophy allows them to become re-sublimated into philosophy.
Well, they were clinicians, so they were doctors. They were dealing with, illness, psychic illness in a way. So, but I'm wondering if this, in response to Adley's question about making the unconscious conscious, is it possible to say that for Freud, the kind of the pertinence of that is so much is unconscious. I don't think we need to make everything that's unconscious conscious, but what we need to make conscious are the conflicts. So conflict as being kind of important. So when we have inner conflict that's not conscious, then it kind of drives us. So the conflict. Sorry.
I want to suggest a simple formula for this. Turning unknowns into unknowns. Does it work?
Say it again. Sorry, I didn't hear.
Turning unknown knowns into known unknowns.
Great. Yeah.
It's great.
That's beautiful. I think I'm in no way expert on like the yogic practice, but that's like my interest right now also to look into. So it seems to me that also what they speak about in terms of the unconscious, it's basically just memory. So it's the whole body of memory. And so you cannot get rid of it, but you can act consciously around. And also they say, like, if you act unconsciously, then you create new memory. So you're creating new karma. I think that's such an interesting idea, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, the yogic idea is kind of like, I mean, the most popular metaphor for the yogic idea of unconscious is the unburned seed. They think that every time you act, you plant seeds in a way into your body. And the yogic practice is in a way designed to make the seeds burn away so that there doesn't remain any seeds for actions anymore. And the ideal result is that your actions are no longer black or white. I mean, everybody else acts black or white, but the yogic person doesn't act in a black or white manner.
Yeah, and the interesting is also that it's not about necessarily becoming that the unconscious is something you step out of in some sense.
I agree with that. The unconscious is not something you step out of. It's, to go on Zizek's formula of turning unknown knowns into known unknowns, is that you start to view unknowing as a positive thing. Whereas for me, the problem of the scientific ego is that it's and the ego in general, is that it's stabilized by a bunch of unknown knowns. They think they know something that they don't know. And so it's threatened by the unknowing.
Yeah, I think that's also a good sign if you're getting wiser, is that you find yourself that you know less and less the more you know, in some sense.
And I think the ultimate form of knowing is that you know nothing, and that there's nothing to know. Like this is how Alenka Zupancic ends What is Sex. If you look at the last pages of What is Sex, I highly recommend. She says that the unconscious is nothing but a unique form of unknowing, which is sort of like our knowledge circulates around this gap of unknowing. And that it's just seeing this unknowing, and that there's nothing to know. That this gap of unknowing is the unconscious, and that just seeing that as a positive thing, because even if you think of the straw man of Hegel, and even if you might say, okay, that's the real Hegel, that he eventually you know everything. Eventually you just know everything. You have the absolute knowledge. You have all the knowledge. Like I would say that's more in, for example, the Newtonian fantasy of, Laplace, and that if we knew every particle, that we knew all the movements of all the particles, that we would eventually know everything. Nothing would be a mystery anymore. I think it's just simply reality is ontologically mysterious. And that's a good thing. And that if we give ourselves to the unknowing authentically, that there's a joy in that too. Not just a joy in adding knowledge.
I think there's even a wish for that kind of rationality to be seduced into the opposite.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Like the way of sorting the whole world, like the Newtonian way you talked about. I think like the very rational mind also has a longing for the mystery. Maybe disguised, I think.
I think it's that the rational mind that has a longing for the mystery is oftentimes can be non-dialectical, in the sense that they propose a way in which that there is a mystery, but that their rational mind will solve it and get rid of it. I think this is the trick of the non-dialectical rational mind. That they always phrase it as, okay, there's a problem, there's a mystery, there's something we don't know, and I just so happen to have the language that solves it, and I just so happen to want you to identify with it.
Yeah, and you just wait until I have finished with explaining why I did horrible things. I mean, I'm impersonating Rousseau here. He would write about, first of all, why you have to obey his commands, to not condemn him when he gives you his whole rational system. I think that we could probably here also appreciate the fact that the idea of indivisible remainder from Schelling is really a new idea. And when we compare it with the kind of Leibnizian ideal of having the whole reality mapped out in one language, I mean, the idea that this act itself would always produce some kind of new particle or new sort of remainder that cannot be caught into the system. It's something that it's really difficult to articulate in any manner. But I think that the way that Hegel probably reacts to this kind of situation is to say that you don't possess the kind of ideal language beforehand articulation, and the very articulation or the bringing out of the history of the very system itself, it always transforms the end so that you end up in some new place which you didn't really recognize at the beginning. So it's in a way reminding of the way that Freud says that when people in a way get from their treatments and they start to recognize what they have done, what kind of compulsions they are acting on, they get in a way freed out from their previous setting. So a kind of transformation takes place when one articulates the very system. So one can have a psychotic idea like Leibniz that one is in a possession of a way to solve every problem, or the kind of theory of everything, which is a popular idea today also. When one really starts to act out the theory, it always produces some kind of indivisible remainders or some kind of things that really, they get lost in the machinery, so to say. And when one recognizes these facts as a product of the process, then it frees up energy to do some kind of other issues and not be obsessed about the ideal theory or the whole system or something.
Absolutely. I think that that's why the ultimate argument against the theories of everything is just including. You have to include into the theory of everything that there are multiple subjects proposing contradictory theories of everything. So there's a way in which the individual reason wants everything, and I think that everything is lost here. That in the conversation I had with Todd McGowan on Emancipation After Hegel, I think that crucial distinction here, which is also pretty a central focus in the first half of Zizek's Less Than Nothing, is that Kant sees the rational antinomies as a negative thing, that reason is limited, and Hegel merely sees this very same thing as a positive thing. That rational antinomies, that reason is limited, is the very power of reason. That if we're aware that we can't know everything, then we have the ability to go into the mysteries in an authentic way. In an authentic way. You really can discover something, but it's kind of like the Higgs boson. Like, I'll use the Higgs boson. So they have this model of the standard model of particle physics, and the Higgs boson is the missing piece of the model. But the discovery of the Higgs boson breaks the model from within and points towards new physics. So there's a way in which whenever you have this, and the standard model of particle physics is the model they've been working with for decades in quantum field theory, but there's a way in which as soon as you get the missing piece, the absent thing which would complete the whole, it breaks the whole and opens up a new thing.
So do you think that this would amount to some kind of dispelling of the mystery? Or in the paper, he proposes that perhaps one can dispel the amnesia that's in the same manner. So would it be this kind of disenchantment that happens there? Or would it perhaps be just circumscribing the mystery, locating it, the mystery?
I think it goes from mysteries which are like almost pseudo mysteries, and it actually makes reality more mysterious in a real way. Like I want to, what's coming to my mind is the way Zizek says that the ancients didn't even really believe in their gods. That we are more we live in a more enchanted universe today than we think the ancients living in an enchanted universe were.
Because the ancients didn't need to believe. They knew God. You believe when you don't, yeah, belief. We believe when we don't know. It's an approximation towards knowing.
Yeah, and belief actually distances you from the thing that you believe into. I mean, it's in a way that Zizek talks about Hegel's interpretation of Antigone. Antigone first acts out the moral sort of substance without any reflective distance to it. And when this gets her into troubles, then just after that, she starts to believe in these things. It's a long story, but the basic idea is that when we first act out things without any reflection, it's sort of like the paradise of the Genesis story of Bible. We have no reflective distance to it, but when we are reflecting on the way that we were acting in our moral substance, when we become subjects, then we have to kind of believe in things. But I mean, it's a mystery to me. But why do we have to believe in anything? I mean, do you guys have any belief?
I mean, let's take Zizek's example of Niels Bohr's horseshoe. He says he always uses the example of it works even if I don't believe in it. So almost this notion that someone who believes very strongly is guarding against his actual belief, which is too traumatic to bring to consciousness. Like it's almost like I almost feel like I always use the example of the Christian fundamentalism. When someone is very fundamentalist, like I need you to believe in my God, I always see this as you don't really believe in your God.
Yeah,
whereas,
that's so funny. Yeah.
Whereas for me, like for example, I always give the example of on my first ayahuasca experience, I had kind of like this experience of it. It wasn't in words, but this experience of God, and I don't need anyone else to believe it. Like I don't care if you guys think I'm a madness. I don't know.
Because you didn't believe God, you experienced God.
Yeah, and that required my ego to die, which I think is too traumatic for people to actually undergo. So they believe in God to unbelieve somehow. They believe in God so that they can defend themselves. It's an ego defense. It's a rational ego defense against the real of God, in some sense. There's a really interesting way in which radical atheism opens us up to God. That's Zizek's point. Zizek's point is only an atheist can really believe. That someone whose ego is really strongly believing in God does not really believe, which is why they need the ego defense. There's something very traumatizing I watched this week. So I watched a psychological analysis of the Casey Anthony trial. Do you guys know Casey Anthony? No? I highly recommend it. To me, it's become the ultimate example of the power of what Freud discovered in Unconscious. Casey Anthony is someone who murdered her own daughter. And then if you see the original tapes of her, she never would admit it to consciousness that she did it. But if you see the original audio and video footage of how she's lying to the police officers, it's the ultimate way of rational ego defense against the trauma of what she did. She could never bring to consciousness that she did it. And her ego, her rationalizations are so good at endlessly creating an illusion that she didn't do it. And it's like cold, ruthless rationalizations. And my thought is that this is a basic, this isn't just Casey Anthony is crazy. This is a basic way to understand how our egos function. That our egos are so good at preventing the real of the negativity from coming to consciousness. And they will do anything to prevent it from coming to consciousness. But everything is to be gained by being brave enough to do this, because she'll be haunted forever. I highly recommend, there's a YouTube video called There's Something About Casey, which I highly recommend. It has the original footage of everything. You see her speech. Just study her speech. It's fantastic and very disturbing. So warning on that one. Is there anything anyone would like to say about these papers before we wrap up? I think we have 5-10 minutes to play around.
Perhaps it would be interesting in a way, just map out the seeming difference between Freud's era when he's writing these things and the current era, and the way that we ideologically just justify some really unscrupulous ideas. It's really remarkable how similar the ideological space is today, and we sort of just profess beliefs in different things. I mean, we believe in yoga, we believe in meditation, we believe in, I don't know, CBD, with scientific methods, whatever. But whatever we believe, if you believe in some kind of psychoanalytic cure, then you're basically mad or something.
But it's the ultimate defense.
I have
Collective defense.
I have to say that I have to say that in my PhD, the level of resistance that I was under from suggesting that Freud is interesting was disproportionate to every other precept, was disproportionate to every other idea I proposed. The reaction is so vicious. Like, the ego reaction is immediate, swift, unrelenting, to such a disproportionate level.
Yeah, it's true. And I think that there's a kind of tendency or temptation to start playing on this negativity. I mean, when one starts to notice this, one can start playing around with it. And I mean, it might be another kind of pit trap also.
It can be another trap. I guess I have started to take it as like I think I've progressed by not reacting to their ego reactivity. Because if I react to their ego reactivity, I'm playing into it, and I'm taking their worldview too seriously instead of a symptom.
Yeah, you're caught in their dialectic.
Yeah. So I've lost already.
That's the unconscious becoming conscious there. That's great.
And I would say again for like my situation with writing, co-writing Sex, Masculinity, and God, that it was specifically those signifiers that were resisted in my particular department, in my particular situation. Talking about sex, let's go into it. Talk about masculinity, let's go into it. What is it? Talk about God, let's go into it. What is it? Just openly. I'm not saying anything about it. I'm not saying, oh, we have to be promiscuous or something. I'm not saying, oh, we should go back to old patriarchy. Or I'm not saying, oh, we have to believe like Christians. I'm not saying any of that. Just saying, let's go into what is this? Why so much resistance?
Another thing that might be interesting for you, Cadell, to look at is the Dalia Dipolito case.
Someone told me about this.
So she plotted to murder her boyfriend, and the police kind of watched her and caught her before she did it. And they brought the boyfriend in. And she kept saying, no, I wasn't doing it.
Yeah.
It's a bit like your case. Yeah.
I'll watch that as well. I think these are so valuable cases.
Mm.
This is a good way to study socioanalysis, you might say.
Definitely. Yeah.
To take these seemingly singular, these seemingly peripheral figures, like serial killers or very, very weird behavior, so from normal behavior, to go deeply into it, because I think the potential of this behavior is in everyone. And even that the idea I like is that the deviation often, like the deviation from the rule, is often a clue to a deeper principle.
It's possible that we all do a Dahlia very subtly at every moment.
That was my idea with Casey Anthony too. That we all are Casey Anthony, which is why in the Casey Anthony trial, the amount of egoic negativity towards her was overwhelming. Because in Casey Anthony, we all saw the little part of ourselves which is too negative to bear.
Not me.
Oh, okay. No, okay, that's a good joke. That's good. That's good. Okay. All right, I'm gonna wrap this up. So unless does anyone have anything they really want to get off their
Yeah,
mind?
getting off,
You want to get off?
Yeah, well, just appreciate the fact that it's really, I mean, it's difficult to say why, but there is something really important about recognizing the value of sexuality in a way that Freud does here. And also we should really not succumb to the kind of stupid idea that he's overemphasizing sexuality or anything. In the end, he's saying that, I mean, he recognizes the fact that some neurotics actually are troubled by the fact that they cannot deal with sexuality, and that's another issue. Nothing more intelligible to say right now, but yeah.
I thought he was very nuanced with the way he handled the end of this paper, because he says that people who are overly obsessed with sex and people who are overly prudish about sex are both kind of wrong. It's not everything, and it's not sort of to be completely censored. It's not something that you should just structure your whole life around, and it's not something to be completely censored, but something that just the intellect needs to actually work with, accept is there.
Also in this connection, I would like to say there's some idea that I don't really know how to deal with in Freud. And he says that in cases of psychoneurosis, the cure is not by any drug or hypnosis, but by the personality of the physician. So this brings us to the discussion of re-education of our sexual life and everything like that. I mean, I don't know what to do with this statement. How can one cure with a personality? And isn't this kind of like leeway for the most like
I think this is
unscientific ego psychology also?
Well, I think this is what Roshanik was saying about the analytic method involving this tension between the two, and irreducibly so, that the analyst and the analysand are in a tension with each other. And I think what Freud's saying here is that the personality or the disposition of the physician actually is a part of this whole process.
Yeah.
And that the technique, their ability to use technique and their ability to influence the process is part of the process.
well, just the way I am reading it, is he suggesting that we need some kind of role model? That was a slip, mother. Sorry, but yeah, just do we need some kind of role model for us to act in the world? Is it? I mean, this sounds really unscientific or whatever. I don't know.
I think there's a process of the master slave. There's a process of the master slave dynamic, like where we need a human master at certain points in our development. Yeah. Like even Zizek says we need masters at certain points in our development. Like, of course, Hegel would say the ultimate master is death, but not everyone's at that level, so to speak.
Yeah.
So you do need.
I personally do really appreciate Freud's ethos, the way that he appreciates culture and everything. I think that he is a role model, but yeah.
So the personality of the analyst, it's also the conflict of the analyst, the neurosis of the analyst. That's his instrument. Because he's actually trying to kind of be aware of his own contradiction.
Yeah.
In with the patient. So that's the instrument, his own kind of, I suppose, psychopathology or whatever you might want to call it, not some kind of an enlightened, I mean, his capacity to reflect and to look and to be with the negative is his instrument.
Does this go into conflict with Lacan's claim that I read just earlier, that Lacan claims that the real is his own symptom? Does it go against this kind of idea that the conflict is within one's personality, since personality would be obviously in the imaginary register with meanings?
Yeah, I think the choice of the word personality is probably makes it confusing. I wonder if it is the conflict within the person in terms of the imaginary and the real. So, the persons struggle with their own real rather than inside the imaginary. Because, the analyst is constantly trying to kind of be with the negative, we with the unknown, suspend with knowing, but in doing so, being able to kind of fish out what may be going on, interpreting that back, and that's the technique. And to know what to interpret, to know what to reflect back at a time where the patient is ready to hear. And I mean, obviously the resistance comes in, but it's very beautiful when it does happen. So it's almost like, sorry, I don't want to take.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it. And I was just concerned about this very phrasing of personality, since I'm really, I think that Freud would definitely not go towards the kind of cult of personality which Hegel criticizes at the end of Phenomenology of Spirit. I mean, it's really a common tendency. I mean, I think the modus operandi among artistic circles, the cult of the personality.
Yeah.
It's something that we need to overcome, really.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, I appreciate all of your personalities.
Yeah.
You have all made this an infinitely more enjoyable process in my experience. And with that, I will close by just saying this workshop, we talked about basically psychoanalytic procedure and a paper called On Psychotherapy, really focused on method and both the historical need and context of the emergence of psychoanalysis and also its limits. Also where we need to think innovatively, where we need to realize, of course, Freud and psychoanalysis itself, although a huge innovation, I think we all more or less agree. At the same time, we have to keep on pushing our thought. Yeah, So we'll reconvene again. Again, I will send out notification in another 2 weeks for the next Freudian workshop. And I thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Kadel.
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Nice holidays.
You too.
Goodbye.